afternoon. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor and pleasure to return to Dubai. I've been here many times, and it's quite remarkable to see what's happening over these several days. Today, I'm going to talk about a world of surprise, a world of uncertainty, a world characterized by turbulent change, in a world interconnected, where every little ripple of change becomes a tsunami as it gets accelerated around the world in this highly connected information age. Governments regularly encounter turbulence and surprise, and you hear again and again, who could have imagined when these surprises hit? But the truth of the matter is, they are foreseeable. We can anticipate change. We can see the surprises coming, and we can actually do something about it. This is a familiar list of events that have occurred over the last 20 or 30 years that have surprised governments everywhere. Perhaps the biggest one was the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Let me say, that was foreseen, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. 9/11, the attack on New York City, was perhaps the most anticipated surprise. Again and again, our government said, who could have seen? 4 different teams in the United States saw it coming. Why? Because in 1993, a similar attack occurred. And 4 years later, Mr. bin Laden said, I will send a storm of aircraft into your towers. What might he have meant by that? This was a failure of imagination, not a failure of prediction. It could be seen. The 2008 financial crisis was easily seen. So many different writers, economists wrote about it. The government of Singapore saw it coming and prepared for it. It could have been foreseen. One of the big ones, the population bomb. When I was a young man, Paul Ehrlich, the Stanford University professor, wrote a famous book called The Population Bomb. And the world's population was to be accelerating and transforming the world. And now we look around the world, and nearly everywhere, the growth of population is slowing, even in places like China and India. And in fact, many countries will face the problem of too few people, not too many people. And so this was another surprise that was seen coming. One of the ones that I find rather dramatic at the moment is the impending end of the private automobile. I'm a car junkie. I suspect many of you are as well. I love cars. But my son does not. And the automatic car, you see one parked out here, one of the very first ones, very cool vehicle. That's the future of the automobile. Our children will stop driving, and their children will wonder, they'll look at the car like we look at horses today. Now, racing is a big deal here, but very few of us go to work in horses today. In 1896, there were 16 million working horses in America, and only a decade later, only 3 million. Nobody goes to work on a horse today. They go to work in a car. And we will look back at cars the same way in another 20 years. The camera. If you were Kodak, who actually invented the digital camera, and you forecast the future of photography, and you got it right, you would have seen billions more photographs being taken, but no film being used. It was only going to be digital photography. Anybody here use film recently? Anybody take pictures? Of course. You probably took 100 pictures today while you were here, of friends and events and so on, and none of them were on silver halide film. They were all in a digital memory stick. So what we've seen, and now we've even seen in scientific events, fundamental surprises that transform the world. I happen to live in Berkeley, California. 22 Nobel laureates live in my neighborhood. 4 doors up the street is a Nobel laureate by the name of Saul Perlmutter. And in 1998, Saul ran a big experiment at UC Berkeley trying to prove that the universe was slowing down as all the matter in the universe gradually attracted all the others and gradually decelerated the universe. And much to his surprise, and every other physicist, they found exactly the opposite, that the universe is accelerating. All the matter is accelerating away from each other. Some mysterious force, which we have called dark energy, it's dark because it's mysterious, we don't know what it is transforming the very nature of the physical universe itself. And only in the last 2 years, both at Berkeley and Harvard, a major new discovery in genetics, what's called CRISPR, the ability to engineer genes, to edit genes, that may eliminate most genetic diseases within a relatively few years. Total surprise in the scientific field. No one expected only a few years ago we would have that kind of power. And yet every one of these events was foreseen. Not a one of them was a real surprise. But to almost everyone, they appeared to be surprises. So why is that the case? Well, you know, the truth is that the signals of surprise are out there. And I particularly like this quote from Friedrich Schiller: "Often do the spirits of great events stride on before the events, and in today already walks tomorrow." The signals are out there. They can be seen, and they can be seen in such ways that one can actually do something about it. So, for example, I mentioned the end of the Soviet Union. Well, I was head of scenario planning at Royal Dutch Shell in the 1980s, very active in the oil and gas business, as you know, and our single biggest future competitor at the time was the Soviet Union. They were a huge natural gas exporter. And the question was, should we develop a major new gas field in Norway, which was much more costly than the Soviet gas, or should we hold off? And so we realized that, in fact, what was protecting our natural gas price was the Cold War. That as long as the Cold War was going on, the Europeans would not want to buy too much Soviet gas. But if the Cold War ended, suddenly our gas, which was much more costly, would be a serious problem. So what did we do? Well, we studied in depth what was going on in the Soviet Union. And what we found was that an economic crisis was inevitable. This was 1984, and we said somewhere in the next couple of years, there will be a major economic crisis. What we don't know is what the outcome of that will be. So, in fact, what we identified were a set of indicators that would tell us what would actually happen. We said if a man named Gorbachev came to power, if he brought with him an economist by the name of Abel Agenbagian, who was writing about reform in the Soviet economy, and if he used Lenin's new economic philosophy as his ideology. And sure enough, in April 1985, Gorbachev comes to power. In May, he brings Agenbagian to Moscow to become his chief economist. And in June, he gives a speech to the Presidium on Lenin's new economic philosophy. We knew by the summer of 1985 that the Soviet Union would be gone by the mid-1990s, and we would be drilling for oil in Russia, the country of Russia, no more Soviet empire. This could be seen. We saw it moving. We saw the indicators, and we were prepared and acted in a timely way for the collapse of the Soviet Union. What appeared to be a surprise to everyone was not a surprise to us. And it was not because we had any magic or a crystal ball. We did our homework. We did rigorous analysis, and we were imaginative in what we could see. And as a result, we saw it in a timely way. We had the indicators that told us which of the scenarios we saw coming would actually play out. So even a surprise as big as the collapse of the Soviet Union could be seen and acted upon in advance. So the fundamental issues are this. It's really two things. First of all is actually trying to see things coming, thinking the unthinkable, anticipating those black swans that Nassim Taleb wrote about, and avoiding fatal errors. No organization can afford to make a fatal error. Kodak made a fatal error in failing to see the transformation to digital technologies. How many companies of the Fortune 500 of 1970 still exist? Less than 200. Less than 200. And all the other 300 made those fatal errors of failing to anticipate the kind of surprises that transform industry. But it isn't enough to actually see the future coming. You have to do something about it. So the second question is acting in advance, in a timely way, either to prevent things that you don't want to happen or to take advantage of opportunities that are coming along. So the fundamental question is, can I see it coming? And can I do something about it? Those are the two issues. Getting the future right and not doing anything about it is a failure. I spent many years as a business consultant, and I can tell you that telling a CEO, I told you so, and you didn't do anything, is not a recipe for getting more business in the future. So the truth is that it isn't enough to just see the future. You actually have to do something about it. So why is it that we fail to see the future? Well, frankly, most often it's because we don't want to. because our mental map of how the world works and why things happen as they do is an old mental map. It isn't the mental map for the world as we see it. And this is a map of North America. It's an old map. I happen to own the original of this because it's not particularly valuable. I bought this on Portobello Road in the 1980s. It cost me about 60 pounds. And the reason it's not particularly valuable is that all the maps were drawn like this for a long time. Now, if you look at this map carefully, you may notice something unusual about this map. I happen to live in the state of California, and if you look at this map, you will see that suddenly my state has become an island. Now, when I left California, it was not yet an island. Maybe after the next great quake, it will be. And the truth is, in the United States, many people wish it were this way, that California was kind of drifting off the coast. But the truth is, this is, of course, not reality. But what is interesting about this map is how it came to be, how it was used, and how it was changed. Because the first maps were actually right. They showed all of the West Coast as one big terra incognita. And then the Spanish, who were actually colonizing Mexico, came up the California coast all the way to today what we call Seattle, and they saw the Puget Sound, and they said, well, that looks like it keeps going south. The Sea of California goes north. This must be an island. And they created on their map the island of California. Now, this would only be a historical curiosity were it not for the fact that missionaries actually used this map. And they would land at Monterey Bay, which was the first port, and go inland to bring the word of Christianity to the American Indians. And what happened? Of course, they would have to take their boats with them because they would have to sail across the Sea of California. Well, they went over the mountains all the way down the other side where they found this beach that went on and on and on. And of course, they realized they were in the deserts of Nevada. There was no Sea of California. They wrote back to the map makers in Spain, and the map makers said, no, 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 you're in the wrong place. The map is right. Now, this sounds silly, but this actually went on for a very long time. The Spanish got it wrong in 1605. The King of Spain, Philip II, forced a change in 1685. This map was drawn 20 years after that by a British mapmaker who was challenged by the Spanish and said, I have the diary of a sailor who's been all the way around the island of California. Finally, he changed his maps in 1721. The last map like this that I can find is 1765. So what's the message? If you get your facts wrong, you get your map wrong. If you get your map wrong, you do the wrong thing. But worst of all, once you believe a map, it's very hard to change. And that is the problem in almost every government agency. You're there for good reason. And the problem is that your mental maps have to be challenged. And that's where the surprise failures come from, is that failure to challenge one's own mental map. And that's what's at issue here. To see the surprises, you have to challenge your own belief systems of how the world works and why things happen as they do. Now, the next slide I'm going to show you is probably the costliest slide in business history. And I mean that literally. The next slide is a $200 billion slide. $200 billion. It is the single biggest error in business history. The reason this slide looks kind of funky and crude is that it was a slide done at IBM in 1980 when they were making a decision about a new product they called the personal computer. Then they made giant mainframes and sold maybe 50 or 100 mainframes a year, maybe some mini computers. So they were trying to predict what was the model for the future of the personal computer. And they said, well, at $2,000 a copy, and how many are we going to sell? Well, you notice that it rises, and you probably can't see the numbers across the bottom, but through all channels over the first 5 years, the forecast was for 241,000 units. And of course, they would peak in 1983 and then go south, because no one would buy a second one because these weren't very useful devices. So this was a product that was going to be very short-lived. So they said, you know, at $2,000 a pop, that's only about $1 billion business. Well, there's this kid from Seattle named Gates, and he's offering us for free the right to use an operating system. And it's not worth it to us, IBM, to develop a $1 billion operating system. So we'll take this system from this kid Gates. And Intel has some chips that will work on this Z80 chip. We'll put the Intel chip in, and we'll call it an IBM-compatible computer. It was at that moment that IBM almost lost its future. Fortunately, it was a great company. It was able to come back from this disaster. But of course, what was the right answer? Not 241,000, but 25 million. And this slide is why Bill Gates is the richest man on earth. Because IBM had an old mental map that people would not want personal computers. They couldn't imagine what people could do. They failed to see the big surprise that would transform their industry. Now, were these people stupid? No. And were these all men? By the way, ladies, it was an all-male group. Maybe if they'd had some women in the group, they might have been a bit more imaginative, but they weren't. It was an all-male group. And they got it completely wrong and almost lost the company. This is a real failure of imagination. Could they have seen it coming? Absolutely. Did Bill Gates see it? Did Intel? Did Steve Jobs? They all did. IBM was in denial, and it was denial. It was not that it couldn't be seen, it's because they didn't want to see it. So the way you do it, the way you think about it, so in fact, I've worked on an idea called scenario planning, a tool for thinking about surprise. And the way people usually think about the future is they start with today and they project out into the future, and they shade that projection maybe a little bit up, a little bit down. And so we call that, in fact, a way of seeing what the small variations in the future might be, sensitivity analysis, if you will. However, the big surprises don't look like that. To get to the big surprises require real unconventional thinking. You have to imagine a very different future and then see how we can get from here to there. Imagining what a city without private automobiles look like. Well, I had the privilege of doing that. I helped write a movie called Minority Report, in which you may have seen what Washington looks like without private automobiles. We tried to imagine what that might be like. Well, the government of Singapore is in fact moving in precisely that direction. But it requires a leap of imagination with real analysis to looking at several different ways to get from the future to the present, to imagine how the present can become the future in different ways. So it requires rigorous analysis on the one hand and creative imagination on the other. If it's just rigorous analysis, it's pedestrian and fails to see the what's possible. If it's just imagination, then it's science fiction. And I write science fiction, and that's not good enough. You need to really be able to see in a rigorous way what the possibilities may be. So to develop that, one has to ask, first of all, what are the important questions? What do we need to know? Is a financial crisis coming? What will happen with the price of oil? You think about the price of oil, right? That affects everybody here. I've been in this industry for 40 years. This is the fourth price crisis that the industry has been in since I've been involved, since the 1980s. We seem to forget that when the supply goes up and the demand goes down, the price will drop. This is what happens every time, and this is the fourth time it's happened. And somehow we seem to forget that it happens. So first of all, we have to figure out what's the right question. Then we have to look at what are the big drivers of change? What are the forces that are going to affect it? What are the big uncertainties that are likely to affect it? The supply uncertainties in the world of oil, the demand uncertainties. What's happened with China, for example, is an example of what happens with looking at the uncertainties of demand. Try and understand what the basic scenarios are, what the crucial stories that give facts to those meaning, and then critically, what does it mean? What are the options and what are the indicators that will tell us what is likely to happen? So this requires systematic analysis, understanding the right questions, and creative imagination to understand what stories give shape to the future. And the test here is not about being right or wrong about the future. The test is, did it lead to better decisions? And that's the real objective. Because the truth is, if you do your homework well, if you are adequately imaginative, you will see the future. The real test is, did we make better decisions in the present about the future? That's the measure of success, not better prediction. So, how do you use this tool? Well, first of all, it's about improving the conversation among leaders in government. And what I observe, frankly, is that some governments do this better than others, that strategic conversation. Frankly, I think the best in the world is the government of Singapore. They, for example, feel profoundly threatened. That's why they do it so well. They believe that they can be overwhelmed instantly by plague, by economic developments, by two powerful neighbors on either side who don't love them very much. So they are paranoid, rightly, about basic survival. So they take the notion of surprise very seriously. Your own government here in Dubai has a great team in the Prime Minister's office that has been thinking about the future creatively for a number of years. I've had the pleasure of working with them. You're one of the best governments. The British, the Dutch, the French, these are all very good. My own government in the United States, not so good. Most of the governments of the world, not so good, because they don't want to see it. They don't want to see the change coming. They don't have the right kind of conversations among the leadership, the kind of strategic conversations. They're always captured by the present moment and don't look ahead. They've got to ask the right questions, even if they're uncomfortable questions. Most of the surprises make us uncomfortable. So asking the right questions in the face of that is important. As I said, it requires rigorous and imaginative thinking. And you have to look at what are the indicators and actually see what is likely to come. In 2007, when Lehman Brothers went belly up, and everybody said, well, maybe that's the only one, there was a very clear indicator that something very big was happening. And if you'd looked then at what was happening in the housing prices, et cetera, what was happening with the quality of loans, you would have reached the conclusion, as a number of other people did, that in fact a crisis was imminent. The government of Singapore saw it coming and prepared well for it. It can be done. And then finally, it's a question of acting in time. Do you believe your forecast? Do you believe your scenario enough that you actually act before it happens? And that requires courage on the part of governments, and very few governments show much courage. But it requires courage to act in advance of events. So how do you actually use this in a kind of thought way? Well, first of all, many officials, because of their very success, are very confident about the future. In fact, overconfident in their judgment. They don't ask the right questions. So part of the issue is how do you challenge that confidence about the future with better questions? They think from the inside out. They don't see the outside. They live inside a political bubble. They don't see the issues outside that will transform the world that's coming. They don't see the whole story. They only look at a little slice of it. They get the problem wrong, and critically, and almost every time I've gotten the future wrong, it's because there was inadequate diversity of opinion in the group that I was dealing with. Every time, it's because there's too narrow a view. To see the big changes, you need a breadth of view, a diversity of points of view that would actually challenge the conventional wisdom. Then you need to identify what are the big indicators. What are those things out there that can happen that would tell us which scenario is actually unfolding? So we always look for those indicators in advance, and then we track them to see if we can actually see what's unfolding. If we get it right, then the question is, what do we do? Well, in the case where it's a bad outcome, can we actually prevent the outcome from occurring? Climate change is a good example. We could have prevented the financial crisis in 2008 if we'd acted in a timely way. Again and again, you think about the SARS outbreak that affected Asia, quite preventable. Most of the diseases actually cast their signals in advance. Can we see them coming? So you can be better prepared. Can you gain maneuvering room so that when they do occur, you have options? The worst place to be as a government is to have no options when things actually occur. And can you take early action because you have created that maneuvering room? I'm going to skip this one in the interest of time and go to the very end. So let's think about what's some of the big surprises that may be consequential for governments that lie ahead. Well, one, the biggest issue that every government everywhere always deals with is the fundamental issue of security, the security of their borders, the security of their people. And sadly, I think we are now in a world where we are going to see continuing conflict from Pakistan to Nigeria. And I think this is one of the greatest challenges of this century, is how can we restore order and peace to that region, the region of which you are all a part. There are isolated pockets of stability and peace. UAE is one, much of the Gulf, but one doesn't need to look very far in either direction to see the chaos. And so this is one that troubles me deeply, is to see the consequences of the kind of conflict that are contained both within the region and also spill over that region. It is probably the single biggest challenge that the world faces over the next 20 to 30 years. The next financial crisis, there will be one. There was one in 1987. There was one in 1997. There was one in 2008. There will be one soon. Maybe it's unfolding even as we speak in China. It could be. Now, I have been impressed again and again with how the Chinese have handled some of these potential crises, so maybe we will avoid it this time. But I would be thinking very seriously about the possibility of another major financial crisis. They seem to come roughly every decade. Climate change. Well, most people think about climate change as an issue that lies somewhere in the distant future. Wrong. It's now. Climate change has already begun, and when the climate changes, it does not change slowly and gradually. It changes suddenly and abruptly. It's a turbulent fluid. My background is I'm actually an astronautical engineer. I'm a rocket scientist, literally. That's the only virtue of my degree. I actually get to say I'm a rocket scientist. And I actually helped lead one of the very first studies of global climate change in 1977. In 1977. When we already began to see that the world's climate was becoming more turbulent and more unstable. And we are now in a world of abrupt climate change. We will see more extreme weather in more places more often. The kind of droughts we've had in the United States, the kind of dramatic storms that the UK has experienced recently, the flooding in China, and so on. So we are going to see abrupt climate change as the new reality that we face. Now, a pleasant surprise for the world would be the actual ability to make clean energy with fusion power. Now, in the world of physics, this has always seemed about 50 years off. But right now, in a laboratory at Lockheed in California, they're working on a small-scale fusion generator. Now, will this work? I don't know, to be honest, but it's worth looking at because the consequences for the world would be huge in a very positive sense. It would be the ultimate source of clean energy. If that happens, it transforms the world. Now, a crazy surprise that everyone say, well, that can't possibly happen, would be a Trump presidency, right? Can anybody here imagine what it would be like if Donald Trump were president? Well, that seems entirely implausible. It's a surprise, right? Everybody's laughing. Oh, it would be a nightmare, not a dream. But it's not impossible. It's not. I don't think it's very likely. Maybe I'm in denial. Maybe I'm hoping. But nevertheless, one must to think about this man is leading the polls in the United States. It's not impossible that he could be the next president of the United States. It seems crazy, but in thinking about surprise, it's one that lies out there. You have something remarkable next door here, the Museum of the Future. It's quite wonderful. I urge you to go take a look at it. And two of the things you will see there are two of the biggest surprises you can already see coming. Human enhancement, first of all. That is, better human beings. I mentioned earlier the CRISPR genetic technology that allows us to edit genes. Within a few years, we will start eliminating all of the genetic diseases of humankind. And your children's children will have none of those diseases. We are going to make people who are stronger, better, larger, smarter, and so on. And we're already part of the way there. I'm part cyborg. I had cataracts in both of my eyes and have had both of my lenses replaced over time. I now have the eyes of a 5-year-old. I wore glasses since I was 7 years old, and my tennis game has never been better. I can see the ball coming off my opponent. A year ago, I had my right hip replaced, and it's an iOS 9 operating system. But I'm now part cyborg. I'm a better human being than I was 3 years ago. And every year, I'm going to get better still. As I said, my tennis game has never been better at age 69. So we're going to see old people who don't look and feel as old as they used to because we're going to enhance their abilities. But soon we'll start enhancing young people's abilities, biologically, genetically, and with drugs. And I'll tell you something that will shock you. That is that before too long, your children will be taking drugs for school. Neural drugs that improve their memory, that improve their cognitive functioning, that improve their vision, and so on. Because we're already developing those drugs for people who have problems, old people like me, to improve cognitive functioning, to improve vision, to improve memory, etc. And so the day will come when children just like they have, make sure they have a good breakfast before they go take their exams, they take their pills before they take their exams that make them smarter, more capable. We're moving into the world of neural enhancement. And finally, the last surprise you can see coming is neural control. And again, you can see it in the Museum of the Future, the idea of metal implants that allow us to control devices from our brain. And where is that coming from? Well, it is already the case that we're working with people who've lost limbs, who have prostheses for legs and arms, and the first of those is already now available that can be controlled by the brain. So there's a brilliant biophysicist at MIT by the name of Hugh Herr, and Hugh lost the lower half of both of his legs when he was a teenager in a climbing accident. He went on to become a biophysicist at MIT, and he has now invented legs that he controls with his own nerves. And in fact, he has many legs. He has chrome legs for going out. He has climbing legs, dancing legs, many legs that go backwards and forwards. And he makes the fundamental point. That is that the upper half of his body is deteriorating at the same rate as all the rest of us, but the lower half is improving on a 3-month innovation cycle. And it gives you a hint of what's to come. So my point in all of this is to say, we can see these surprises coming. If we do our homework, if we do our thinking in a rigorous way, we can see if we imagine what is possible out there. And most especially, if we take those surprises in a serious way, we can act in a timely way. We can have our governments avoid being trapped by unanticipated events, avoid being trapped by the great uncertainties. And they can, in fact, think the unthinkable. Thank you very much.